we get going. I'm David Theo Goldberg. I direct the University of California Humanities Research Institute. It's a pleasure to have you all here and to have our panelists sitting ready to roll. So they'll be introduced momentarily. It's a pleasure to have you here for a panel forum on narratives of resistance, though the topic of violence within the prison system is hardly pleasurable. It's good to see that there's pushback and people thinking about what it would take to end violence in this regard. This forum is co-sponsored by the Initiative to End Family Violence here at UC Irvine and the University of California Humanities Research Institute. Gabriela Cazares in our office has put this forum together, including having raised external funding and so on. So it's all kudos to her that this is happening. It's part of a more general undertaking on the part of UCHRI, the Institute, around an initiative, a larger research initiative we're calling Horizons of Humanities, which is a forum to address pressing questions across the humanities in various dimensions. This particular forum fits into a focus under Horizons of Humanities on issues of diversity. And overall research initiative is funded by the Mellon Foundation. So it's a pleasure to have you all here, and I'm sure we're in for a really insightful and interesting couple of hours. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Gabriela, who will introduce the speakers. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
My name is Gabriela Cazares, so I'm a postdoc here at HRI and your moderator for today's panel. So this panel was really created out of a continued pressing urgency. Across the nation, in California especially, the prison industrial complex has unrelentingly and disproportionately devastated working class communities of color across multiple generations. Prisoners, detainees, and their loved ones face endless challenges when it comes to the prison industrial complex. This is often augmented by poverty, the loss of social capital due to the stigma of criminalization, to children facing behavioral issues, and a higher likelihood of academic failure. A lot of the times these topics are treated as separate issues. And what the colloquium really does is making sure that we talk about them all together, right, as products of larger issues grounded in historical and institutional oppression. So obviously this colloquium brings together methodological approaches from historical, art, theater, literature, media, cultural studies, and the importance of coming together with community organizations to really explore different options in order to continue resisting, right, and pushing back. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists in alpha order. So to my left, I have Ashley Lucas. She is an associate professor of theater and drama and also the director of the Prison Creative Arts Project at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her research and writing includes razor wire women, prisoners, activists, scholars, and artists. She's also the author of the ethnographic play Doing Time Together Through the Visiting Glass, centered on families with loved ones in prison. Next we have Dylan Rodriguez. He's a professor of media and cultural studies at UC Riverside and was one of the first professors to introduce me to the prison industrial complex back in my undergraduate days. Amongst his numerous accomplishments, he is the author of Forced Passages in Prison Radical Intellectuals and the U.S. Prison Regime, and he's also the founding member of Critical Resistance Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex, which seeks to end the prison industrial complex by challenging the belief that caging and controlling people makes us safe. We also have, in blue, to my far left, Christina Shull. She's a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. She received her PhD for her dissertation, Nobody Wants These People, Reagan's Immigration Crisis and America's First Private Prisoners. She's also a former Sorrow Justice Fellow, and also co-edited an anthology of poetry and art by people in detention entitled Call Me Libertad, Poems Between Borders. And last but certainly not least, we have Mary Weaver. She is the executive director of Friends Outside Los Angeles County, or FOLA. Under her leadership, FOLA has grown extensively, assisting children and families, prisoners and former prisoners with the immediate and long-term effects of the prison industrial complex through multiple very impressive programs, might I add. FOLA was recently awarded a $5 million grant to grow its much needed services. So with such an amazing all-star panel, we're going to go ahead and start with Dylan. I'll pose a question to you, but like all panelists are obviously free to engage and respond. So Dylan, what are the various types of violences generated by the prison industrial complex, and why is it important that we move beyond it, the prison industrial?
What's my time limit? I'm kidding. I'll be concise and try to make some statements that will open things up to a discussion. So I want to attack some of the premises, not attack. I want to engage some of the premises of how we pose the question, and I want to think about how we understand violence as infrastructure. The way I would get at this question is to first of all consider how it is that there is, on the one hand, a kind of institutional, relatively symbiotic institutional arrangement that we call prison industrial complex. And then there's something else that is adjacent to it, that constitutes it, that I would call a carceral regime. And in thinking about a carceral regime, what I'm trying to get at are the logics of violence and power that make up the reproduction of what we call the prison industrial complex. That is, if we challenge the kind of progressive liberal narrative that the prison industrial complex is reproduced as a matter of economic hyper-exploitation of so-called prison slave labor, which is not its logic, right? That is not, it's not about, prison industrial complex is not about incarcerated slave labor producing goods for private industry at all, right? There is an absolute hyper-exploitation of chattel in incarcerated sites, but they generally are exploited to actually run the prisons themselves, right? So it's not about a kind of advancing a capitalist economic or neoliberal economic agenda. You know, they don't need to do that in the United States. They can go to the Philippines, they can go to Guam, they can go to India, they can go elsewhere. So that's actually not an animating logic. So what I'm interested in, by way of your question, is to think about how it is that violence in a particular kind of constellation, a particular set of registers of violence, is actually what constitutes and reproduces the carceral regime, the power relations of the carceral regime. So I want to think about how it is that the carceral regime is an infrastructure of violence production, that in fact incarceration actually invents forms of violence. An old friend of mine who was one of the leading figures in founding critical resistance named Terry Coopers, a psychologist, he actually gave expert testimony in a number of federal cases back in the late 90s that inscribed into the kind of the language and vernaculars and diagnostic protocols of psychology something called SHU syndrome, security housing unit syndrome, right? And what he was addressing was the particular kind of dysfunction, disorder, physiological and psychological violence that was actually created by the conditions of incarceration that were invented in the security housing unit. Y'all probably somewhat familiar with that, right? Like the 24 hours lockdown, fluorescent lights in your face all the time, no human contact other than cavity searches, et cetera. So when I think about how the carceral regime invents forms of violence, I mean that quite literally, in a material sense of inventing violence. I also think about how it is that the carceral regime produces and invents violence that crosses geographies, meaning from the cultural to the discursive, as well as to the socioeconomic, the residential, the school, the university, the familial, the affective. It constitutes how people love each other and how they hate each other, including inside sites of state incarceration. The other thing I'll bracket this with is that the overarching logic of carceral violence generates over historical time a relatively continuous but changing state of domestic war. So what you actually have is a condition of violence that wages active warfare and actually announces it as such. So it's actually not it's not a secret war. It's fairly openly announced. We all know who it is that become the targets of the carceral policing state. It's relatively clear. The question for us becomes how it is that the kind of cultural structure of domestic war becomes so normalized as inseparable from security, from safety, from criminal justice, even from peace, right? So that's part of the kind of fatal intersection that we're talking about. And what that also does, and this is the polemic I always have to introduce nowadays, since the publication of Michelle Alexander's deeply flawed, widely read but deeply flawed book, The New Jim Crow. We got to stop using the phrase mass incarceration because that's not what it is. It's not an appropriate phrase. It's not analytically useful, precisely because of the logic of war that the carceral regime instantiates. The war is against black and brown people, poor people, queer people, etc. It's not mass, right? So what you have to ask yourself is who the so-called mass is. Then that disarticulates this kind of, in my view, a kind of post-racialist liberal phrasing of mass incarceration. It doesn't work for me. So I think we got to call it what it is. Depending on the audience I'm talking to, I'll actually call it carceral. I'll call it domestic war. So this is actually gendered racial warfare. Last point I'll make is that there's the logic of violence, which also reproduces as part of its logic a logic of carcerality, which is to say, to flip Dostoevsky on his head. I think that if we take seriously how it is that the carceral regime is an infrastructure of violence, then we can also see how it is that the logic of incarceration, how the kind of power relation, the spatial organization, and the logic of dominance that we call incarceration exceeds the sites of the prison, jail, detention center fundamentally, right? And in fact, this is the organizing logic of the U.S. nation building project from the start, right? Meaning a logic of carcerality. I mean, in that sense, the logic of carcerality constitutes social formation more generally, but especially constitutes what we call civil society in the free world. So it's to say that the gendered racial carceral violence of the chattel colonial project, of the chattel colonial project in U.S. nation building is always present, is always distended, and it's continuous and dynamic. So that's my kind of way to frame and get at your question, but I'm sure we could talk. This is I think a way to take another view toward what I think some of our radical criminology colleagues call collateral consequences of incarceration, which I also hear a lot. I think there's a lot of usefulness to that rubric, but as with most analytical rubrics, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We got to kind of complement it and inform it with other kinds of historicized rubrics, so we don't think about this regime as episodic, as compartmentalized, but rather as something that has a continuity to it.
Yeah. So thank you for that. So obviously, given the size, I mean, the fact that it is very much called the prison industrial complex, right? The ramifications are massive, right? And sometimes, too, when we're looking at numbers and statistics and things like that, and thinking about the scope across multiple generations. Mary, this question is for you because I would like to hear more about the types of very, very targeted programs Friends Outside offers that are much needed, and in a lot of ways, how do those programs speak directly to the way, or against the way the violences are being siloed, right? And really acknowledging kind of the fact that it's all stemming from the prison industrial complex.
Well, hello, everybody. So I'm really happy to be here. And if I may say, Gabriella was a volunteer for us 10 years, did we say 10 years ago? So that's how we hooked up. And I really love being here, and I appreciate it in such an esteemed panel. So I'm the experience here. I got a degree in English literature and studied Shakespeare, and I ended up at Friends Outside because I had to do community service. So kind of a different maybe life experience, but thank goodness for that because I love the work that I do and I feel like it's very important. Friends Outside's been around since the 50s, working with families and children affected by incarceration. The founder, I think, was very much ahead of her time in recognizing that there was a community need and there was an overlooked population. in the community. And at one time there were 30 chapters across the county. Now we have only 5, unfortunately, but our LA County chapter is the one I represent. And I sort of hypothesize, I'll use one of those academic words, I hypothesize that when Friends Outside moved from working with children and families to also working with inmates and ex-inmates was because of a report called the Holt-Miller Report that was published in 1972 by the California Department of Corrections, which established, I don't know if for the first time, but it was kind of a seminal study from what I can tell, the relationship between being able to maintain family ties and having somebody getting out of prison and staying out of prison, reducing recidivism. So I believe then that our chapter in this case decided to start working inside the jail. And we started working in Civil Brand Institute, which was the women's jail. This was in 1978. As far as I know, we have the longest running programs inside LA County jails, with the exception of probably the chaplaincy. And our intention of that program was just to be a friendly, non-judgmental visitor to help the women kind of take care of life. You know, your life kind of gets put on hold when you're in jail. And so just everything from I was arrested and I don't know where my children are. I don't know who the social worker is. I'm supposed to be at dependency court tomorrow, but they don't know I'm here, and I'm afraid that if I don't show up, the judge is just going to make figure out I'm a bad parent, right? You don't care enough to even be, because there's no system interaction or little system interaction for them to know that no, she's really incarcerated. The visitors have no ulterior motive. We're not trying to convert them to a religion or you got to believe in God, or we won't do something for you, that kind of thing. So that was the root of our jail-based services. And from there, we have started doing work that's a little more specific. And actually, we started working at Men's Central Jail. Has anybody ever been at Men's Central? If you ever want a real visit through hell, go to Men's Central Jail in downtown Los Angeles. It's unbelievable. We started working there in 1990, and so since this time we have created a few programs that we take into the jails. We have the Incarcerated Parents Program, through which we are kind of proxies for the Department of Children and Family Services. Our staff conducts visits on behalf of the department between the incarcerated mothers and their children who are in foster care. And I believe this happened as a result of a lawsuit back years ago up in Northern California, because the women weren't getting visits from the social workers, and so hence they weren't able to have as many visits with their children. And the goal of that, of course, is trying to keep the family bonds together. Even though I think one of the collateral consequences of incarceration is that it's so hard for the families to stay together. And even though there's this great connection between, being able to have intact family ties and being able to get out, and it's a natural source of support, but the system doesn't necessarily do anything about that. We also have a fatherhood program that we take into the men. It is a curriculum that is an evidence-based curriculum, and we help the fathers to be able to work on their parenting. One of the really dumb things I think that happens is that if the inmates don't know that they need to fill out a form, their arrears keep accumulating while they're incarcerated, and yet the jail doesn't do anything to make sure they fill out the form they need so that they don't get out and now have arrearages that have been accumulating during their whole incarceration. So that's one of the services we provide. We also help them with their family ties to facilitate visits to the degree that we're able. We also have an employment program that we take into the jails. It's a curriculum that we wrote. It's called Parole to Payroll, and it's a job readiness class for the fathers. And we also were involved with a one-stop center to have a one-stop employment center inside Men's Central Jail, which is a program that's just ending. So, these are just programs that we try to at least be able to work with the inmates enough that it gives them some hope, it gives them presumably some skills, regardless of whether they're going on to state prison or going to be getting out, and also so that they can use their time better than they do if they're just sitting in the jail. So to the second part of your question about the violence, and tell me again, please.
And how does it dispel the stigma of criminalization?
Oh, okay. I think so much of it is treating people like people, and not seeing them through the lens, that when I talk to the people we serve, the number one thing that they say to me, when I say, how was your experience at Friends Outside? Fortunately, most of the time they say it was very good. But the one thing they say to me is, I felt like I was treated like a person. I mean, what a concept, right? that they feel like, our staff is there because they really want to be there. They're not just putting in their time sheet and leaving at 5. And it's such a basic thing, but I think it's, for it to be said to me so often, I think it really is important because they don't feel like they're being treated like a criminal first and then, oh, by the way, I'm also a person. So I think that's...
That threat of humanization, I think it's important.
Mhm.
It would be a basic human right that's not extended to everyone.
Mhm.
That really points to larger issues of belonging and unbelonging
Mhm.
and tied to the stigma of criminalization. And a lot of times when we do think about the prison system, we just think about jails and prisons, right? But the immigration detention centers, especially today, and considering who our POTUS is, have grown exponentially. And Tina, this question's for you. How has the growth of our contemporary immigration detention system really served to shape larger narratives of belonging or unbelonging and criminalization?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here and part of this conversation. I think that immigrant incarceration is just another vehicle for the violences of U.S. state-making that Dylan raised at the beginning. Or as historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez at UCLA says, that it's kind of part and parcel of the project of white settler colonialism, the longer histories of immigrant exclusion and incarceration rest alongside chattel slavery and Native American genocide. And so if we look at it in that way, I think that's an apt starting point. But rather than giving a kind of historical overview or lecture, I really want to talk more about history and humanities as a way of thinking about these questions. And as a historian, I'm concerned with stories and asking what stories are told, which stories are not, how they're told, and who gets to tell them. I study the rise of immigration detention since the Reagan era, when immigrant incarceration became, more militarized and privatized. But I come into this from a personal experience of being an affected family member. When I was accepted to UCI's history program, at the same time, my husband was detained and deported. And that informed my whole academic trajectory. When my husband was in detention, I wrote an op-ed about it that was in the Chicago Tribune, and the very next day, ICE made a decision that my husband would be deported. And I have no idea if that was a direct act of retaliation. I will never know. But that kind of was the first step in me starting to think about ways that these systems silence people, that the state actively works to silence people, but also how the traumas of incarceration silence people as well. And as I entered graduate school and I started telling my story in different forums, or choosing not to, which I recognize is a privilege, I would feel a lot of shame and trauma around just my marriage and experiencing a lot of questions from people. I don't understand. You're married. What did he do? This kind of assumption of criminality, and me taking off my wedding ring sometimes because I just didn't feel up to telling my story in a given time and place, feeling guilty about that. And I started wondering why. I started doing academic research. I wanted to uncover the history of this detention system that, as a US-born citizen, I was very invisible to me. And I wondered why there were no containers for my story and the stories that I was witnessing and learning about in mainstream media, in political discourse, but also in academia. And I wanted to start working to help create more containers for stories that don't come out easily, or that are not chosen by journalists to be featured, to create empathy for the good immigrant, and to kind of challenge the criminalization that has been decades, centuries in the making. So alongside my academic work, I was fortunate to receive a Soros Justice Fellowship upon graduation. I worked with a nonprofit, now they're called Freedom for Immigrants, that visits people across the country in immigration detention. And I created a few storytelling platforms for writing poetry, artwork from detention to be published kind of in its own right. And it's really been difficult work. Now I am back in academia. I have a postdoc at Harvard, and I'm teaching a class called Detention, Deportation, and Resistance in U.S. History. And just the other day, one of my students asked, why is it that you can be anti-immigrant, but it's not considered racist? You know, like, why is that something that flies, you know, in today's political debates? And I think for many of us it doesn't, but but there is this pushback, you know, so narrative is really important. I mean, there is a history that is very important to detail about the rise of laws that have criminalized migration, but there's narratives alongside that have buttressed those laws being creative, and it's really important to pick those apart and to question that. So I'm really interested in, as well as in how these systems fuel these narratives of good versus bad immigration and the need to challenge that.
I think one of the things points that you bring up that kind of really makes me think about your ethnographic way, and doing time together, right? And also your other work on razor wire women, in terms of what fueled your own, like, your research, right? And how is it that when having a loved one in prison or detention, like, how is it that we're doing time together too?
Sure, that's again one of those questions that you have to ask. How long do we have to talk about it? We can talk about it all day. Thank you so much for inviting me to come here. I'm delighted to be back in Southern California. I did my PhD down the road at UCSD a number of years ago, so it's fabulous to come back here to the place that really made me an activist at the level that I am today. I'm Ashley Lucas. I teach at the University of Michigan and run a program here called the Prison Creative Arts Project, which takes students and volunteers into prisons every week to do arts programming with people inside. And I came to this work because my father went to prison when I was 15 and ended up serving 20 years in the state of Texas. And during that time, I didn't know what to do with all of that. My family was never ashamed of my father. We were very close to him. We still are very close to him. We love and adore him. And yet somehow people acted like he was dead, like he shouldn't be talked about, like he was non-existent. And I spent the first 8 or 9 years of his incarceration trying to figure out how you say this to people and don't cause a riot. Because every time that somebody asked me what my father did for a living, which is a question that children get asked all the time, it was like this moment of terror. It was that question that Tina was talking about. Do you make the decision to tell this story today, or do you feel too vulnerable to say it in this place to these people? And when I would tell people that my father was in prison, I could never just say that. I always had to have this other giant conversation. Well, why is he there, and what did he do, and how guilty is he, and how guilty are you by extension? And what the hell is your mother doing, still married to him? And this whole giant rigmarole of stuff that, particularly when I was a child, I had no clue what to do with that. And all I wanted to do was to tell people that I love my father, and I really wish he was here to introduce himself to you today. That was the message that I really wanted to carry to people. And nobody wanted to hear that. Everybody wanted to know the story of his crime and his trial and what it was that he did. And nobody wanted to know what had happened to our family. And so he was denied parole 5 times ultimately before he was finally released. And in most states in the country, and certainly in Texas where my father was, they don't have to give you any explanation about why that happens. My father was an older man when he went to prison. He was always very well behaved. He did everything that he was supposed to do. And so there was nothing else that he could do to sort of earn his way out of prison, and it never made any sense to us why he was denied parole. But you just get this letter. This is really funny, actually. In Texas, when you're denied parole, which is basically to say your whole life is still over for another set number of years, however many more years until you get to come up for parole again, you get a multiple choice letter that says you could have been denied because of the nature of your offense. You could have been denied because of your behavior in prison. And it lists about 5 reasons why you might have been denied parole, but it doesn't say which one applies to you, or if anybody even read your file. So that was the letter that we got. And I was completely devastated. He'd done 8 or 9 years at this point. I was in graduate school. I was trying to earn my PhD. And I didn't know what to do. But I had been studying all of these other theater folks who did interview-based and ethnographic theater. And I thought to myself, well, if Anna Devere Smith can do it, I can give it a try. And I really wasn't even sure that I was actually creating a play, but I started telling people that I wanted to write a play about the families of the incarcerated, and that I was looking for people to talk to me about what had happened to their families. And all of a sudden, it turned out that I knew a ton of people who had family in prison who had never spoken about it to me, even if they knew that my father was in prison. All of the people of color that I knew in grad school had at least one loved one behind bars. And then I started joining activist organizations. I started asking people to introduce me to folks, and I started creating monologues based on these stories and developed it into a one-woman show where I play 13 different characters who each have a different relationship to the prison. And the play's called Doing Time Through the Visiting Glass. And I performed it for the first time in 2004 here in Southern California, and thought that I would do it once here and once in Texas so my mama could see it, and then it would just sort of fade quietly into the night and nobody would ever know that it had existed, because it was a grad student project, right? And then it turned out that every time I performed the play, somebody else wanted me to do it somewhere else. And it was not, I think I'm a good playwright and a good actor, but I don't think that's what it was about. I think it was actual, because most of the people who invited me hadn't even seen me perform. They just heard about what I did. And the need to have a conversation about their families was so palpable, such a strong drive, that people invited me all over the place. I've now been performing this play for 14 years, and I've done it throughout the US, inside prisons, not in prisons, college campuses, political bookstores, everywhere that you can imagine, and in prisons and other places, in Ireland, Canada, and even in a trilingual production in Brazil, where my brain kind of melted because I was doing some monologues in English, some in Spanish, and some in Portuguese. But that's how badly people wanted to see the show, was that I had these friends in Brazil who saw me do it in English and said, we didn't understand that, we're gonna help translate the play, please, please, please come do it in Brazil. Because everywhere in the world, we have devastated families. Yeah. Everywhere in the world. I mean, 2.3 million people just in this country. If we conservatively say that everybody in prison knows 10 people who care about them, and that would be a very conservative number, think about how many millions and billions of us there are in the outside world who love somebody who is doing time or did time. And yet nobody wants to talk about that. It is so hard. Gabriella was just saying to me that she discovered my work because she was having such a hard time finding people who wrote about the families of the incarcerated. And I was in the same place when I was in grad school. The work is emerging. There are more people talking about it now, but it's still a very, very small field of interest and concern academically, and yet it affects our lives so profoundly for those of us who live it every day. Even now that my father is home, my heart is sitting in a prison always, because I know what happens to people, and I've met all these other people who are still living it, and I don't have the privilege to forget that ever in my life. So once you actually open your eyes and see what's going on and see what the state, not just our state, but in many other parts of the world, is doing to people, you cannot unknow that. That will haunt you for the rest of your life, so long as we agree to be complicit in these terrorizing systems that Dylan started the panel by describing. So I think the impact that prisons have on families is that it invades everything about our culture, about the way we see ourselves, and about the way we live and navigate the world.
So in terms of this haunting, the title of this colloquium is Narratives of Resistance. What are some of the ways, and you've to a certain extent, each of you have spoken to that we can resist this behemoth that goes across multiple generations? I mean, as individuals, as students, as faculty, as community members, what are some of the ways that resistance kind of takes shape?
Well, I know this sounds a little pedestrian, but I think the first step is that we all have to go to prison. I think that if you have not set foot inside a prison, you cannot know what's actually happening to people right now. And even those of us who visit all the time who've never lived in a prison, don't really have a sense of everything that's happening to people. But until you see with your own eyes, until you get patted down and searched and have the gates locked behind you, whether you're a visitor or a volunteer or somebody touring a prison, when you enter a prison, you are temporarily incarcerated yourself for no matter how brief the time you were there. You can't get out if you want to. At my father's prison, and I think this is true of most of the places in Texas, there's a sign at the front gate that says no hostage shall pass through this gate. And what that means in practical terms is that they'll shoot you before they let you out, because that's of more value is to keep the security of the prison and keep all those people inside than to protect your life or your human dignity. And we can't really talk about how to undo this until all the people who, particularly judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, all of these people who get legislators, governors, presidents, all of those people should have to go to prison to see what it's all about. And I don't mean that we necessarily have to incarcerate them, though some of them have earned it, if that's a thing that can be earned, as much as anybody has earned it. But if people don't actually walk these halls, they shouldn't be able to make decisions about what happens to folks, just like people shouldn't be able to make decisions about our borders if they haven't really lived on one.
You know, thinking about why maybe it doesn't happen more, you think about the families, and I admire you for staying involved even though your father's out, because you know, in our experience, a lot of times the families are so glad when everything's over that they just kind of want to put it behind them. But one of the experiences I had that was kind of eye-opening, and I had heard snippets of like what you talked about, that you know, you don't really know if it was retaliation, but we had a grant I was trying to get, and it was actually to try to empower our support group for families to be able to make some changes to the visiting and what happens in visiting so that it could be more humane. And it was with the Liberty Hill Foundation. We'd gotten past the first half of the process, and like the night before the second part was due, one of the members called me and said, please don't submit the application. And I said, why? They were all so terrorized that if they were perceived to be part of this resistance to what was going on, that their loved one in prison would be punished by that. And so I just have to wonder how much that keeps people who have that voice, who would have something to tell. You know, I remember also hearing a story about a lady from Palos Verdes called, which is not the most common situation. Much more, it's a matter of people in poverty because the others managed to find another way to deal with their crimes. But anyway, she was calling me because her son was not able to get any nourishment. And I said, why? And she says, well, his teeth are rotting and he isn't getting any dental care. He was in prison, of course. And so she said that she had tried to do something legislatively or with her senator or whatever to address that. And she said every time she took a step, her son would be taken out in the middle of the night to be put on the prison bus to go to Vacaville or wherever they had the medical facility, and then he was pulled back off the bus. And that happened like 5 times. So, you know, I don't really know if those things happen, but when you hear enough stories like that, you have to think it's true, and I think it stymies some of the resistance that could possibly go on.
Yeah, for a long time I had this mantra that was, if everybody knew this was happening, it surely wouldn't be happening, right? But I'm not so sure. I mean, how do you make people really believe and know about this and resist it if they don't experience it? You know, and that's a central question for humanities work and thinking about narrative and strategy and all that. But beyond that, I feel like our systems of incarceration, they do render people, you know, silent or speechless, but also their knowledge is rendered kind of unbelievable or unknowable. The author Naomi Pack studies Guantanamo Bay, and she has a book, Rightlessness, that spans Japanese internment, Haitians detained at Guantanamo Bay, and Guantanamo Bay during the War on Terror. And she makes that argument that in the rise of a rights-based society, especially post-World War II, we have the affirmation of rights, but that is always dependent upon the taking away of rights of others, and also their voices and their knowledge. And so I witnessed that time and time again, where people are speaking about abuse they experience in detention and the ways in which it's not believed or not really absorbed by audiences. People brush it aside. They say, I can't even, it's too much. It's either too traumatizing, it's too overwhelming, or it's just unbelievable, or people explain it away as isolated events. And it's really hard to express how this is a systemic, permanent feature of these systems and how historical it is. And we ignore those histories all the time, and just the stories that we tell about who we are as a society, how we operate, how these systems have to exist. And that makes us blind to solutions.
So here's the thing. The carceral regime actually works because of resistance. If we, Angela Davis famously said this, but when we look at the foundations of the modern jurisprudence to some extent, but particularly modern incarceration, especially in the United States, it comes about as a result of a reform. And the reform was a response to people's resistance to other forms of brutal kind of applications of criminal justice that were extraordinarily punitive, et cetera. So from jump, the entire apparatus of criminal justice and incarceration are already working by way of resistance, because resistance is a circuit, right? And if we look at something like the prisoners' rights movement in the 1970s, in all of the kind of phases and in the full spectrum of it, right? From kind of liberal reformist types that just wanted things like more humane conditions in cafeterias and the semblance of healthcare, to those who wanted a liberation of what were deemed prisoners of war and political prisoners, right? There's a whole spectrum of people who advocate for so-called prisoners' rights. The entire kind of infrastructure, jurisprudential and policy infrastructure of criminal justice responded to that, right? They responded to it in a few different ways. They responded to it through kind of brutal, violent repression in places like San Quentin, Attica, et cetera. But they also responded to it through reform, right? So prison from its founding moments is a reform, and in its kind of dynamic reiterations, including the eventual premises for creating the prison industrial complex, it is also a reform. The reason the prison industrial complex exists is precisely in response to the fact that folks wanted to deprovincialize the institutional apparatus of incarceration and include other institutional apparatus, including healthcare, architects, expansion. It was all about expansion. So this is my way of getting at how it is that if we understand that incarceration and the carceral regime work through resistance, then of course resistance is kind of a condition. It's a necessary condition. It's always happening all the time, and we can kind of find all the different ways in which it's happening. I think all of us do it. But I actually don't think that that's the praxis or the thinking or the pedagogy that ought to be engaged if we're going to do what you said in part of your question, which is, I forgot the exact way you phrased it, but you were talking about in some way disassembling or kind of undermining or destroying the prison industrial. So you're talking about abolition.
Yeah.
Right? So if we're talking about abolition, that's potentially friendly and in some coalescence with resistance, but it's critically in coalescence with resistance, because it's always interrogating whether and how a particular form of resistance is friendly and conducive to facilitating abolitionist work. And by work, I don't mean one kind of work. I mean in all the different ways that we can think about abolitionist work, right? From creative and performative to public policy to legislation to, for that matter, carceral counter warfare, right? Which I actually think needs to be supported. I think that there are moments where carceral counter warfare against a brutal, gendered racist, colonial, chattel, state regime, it actually has to be supported. We need to stop being attached to these kind of protocols of nonviolence and understand that sometimes when incarcerated people fight back, they ought to be supported by those of us who have the privilege of supporting them, at the risk of being, bombarded with right-wing memes by our students. Cool, right? That's an honor. I love that. So that's on the one hand. So I think we have to explode the rhetoric of resistance and talk and actually use rhetorics of abolition. Whether we say abolition or not is another question. That's a pedagogical question. It's a political question. But we need to get past the circuit of resistance. Otherwise, we're reproducing the same shit all the time, right? It's also to say that I want to resonate and amplify what my colleagues here have said, which is because resistance is a circuit, then ignorance is also not the problem. Right? Like hitting people with all the statistics of how devastating and asymmetrical and misogynist and homophobic and anti-black and colonial, how deeply all those things this regime is, hitting people with those facts does not necessarily move them. In my encounters pedagogically, it's had this disturbing way of doing a number of things. For people who are Black, brown, Native, queer, etc., it affirms what they kind of already sort of know at some level, right? It's like, yeah, shit's even worse than I thought it was, right? That's the response. And then for folks who kind of see themselves in the kind of in this Enlightenment humanist kind of way as not being attached or connected to that thing, right? Like, well, shit, okay. Then that's how it is. That's how I thought it was. That's how it is. So it actually, but that's part of war,
Yeah,
right? Part of the condition of war is the discourse of war itself, which can actually try to normalize it as not a state of emergency, right? So we're living like kind of multiple realities at once, where some people experience and encounter this regime as a permanent state of emergency, and others experience it as the necessary condition for their safety. Like, it might be flawed, it might be needed reform, but abolition's crazy because this is what we have to have, because otherwise we're not going to be safe as individuals or as a community or my children or whatever.
Yeah, you're talking about pedagogically, like what are the right terms to even address the situation, and I think like even, especially in today's climate, like abolition, a lot of people would just like be completely resistant like to it because they would equate that, it would be equated with chaos, right, and no control, but it also goes back to what you're saying, that it's not mass incarceration, that's not the right term, right, because it's about targeting very specific groups of people, and within that vein, obviously it's important to have an analysis that's very intersectional, right, that talks about race, class, gender, and also sexuality, right, because those are also all very important components that are feeding and shaping our different experiences, right? And experiences, for example, like in the work that you did with Razor Wire Women are very kind of distinct, right? But there's still a lot of similarities too with other men who, or even like women who are in detention, because right, this is all part of the prison industrial complex. And kind of pivoting a little bit, so what do you think are kind of the most pressing kind of issues that are related to like each of your kind of respective like areas of expertise, whether we're talking about gender, we're talking about detention, right? And that's it's an unfair question, right? Because there's so many components that need to be addressed, and it's one of those, well, how much time do we have, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also important that we do have that conversation, especially coming from these multiple angles and dimensions, to see kind of like what we're all kind of thinking about and continuing to build the coalitions and collaborations.
Well, in terms of thinking about women in the system right now, people are often surprised to hear me say that in the state of Michigan, where I live, there are 28 prisons. We're one of the highest per capita incarceration states in the nation, and there's only one prison for women. And for my money, the women's prison is the worst place to do time in all of Michigan. It's the only prison in the state that houses all the different security levels in one place. Oh, wow. Because there's only one place that we put women. So for men, if you get sent to a level 4, which is basically in lay people's terminology, level 4 is the highest security level you can be in without being in solitary confinement. So you're kind of in trouble all the time. Violence is around you. If you were a political organizer, you're likely to be sent to level 4 for a long time because they don't want you organizing inside the prison, those kinds of things. So men in level 4, there are whole prisons of them, and they get programming to the extent that anybody gets programming in prison. They have a little more space and are able to do different things despite the fact that their privileges are restricted. Level 4 women in Michigan get 0 programming. They see no one. They can't even come to the performances that we host of different things in the prison because they don't have enough space to do programming for the level 1s and 2s who have more privileges and to do something for the level 4s. In fact, the level 1s and 2s are always suing the state of Michigan because they don't get as much programming as they have a right to have just for them. And then if you are a child placed in the adult system, which is another group that has very particular concerns and interests, if you're adjudicated in adult court and you're sent as a juvenile to live in an adult prison, you have to be, by federal law, separated by sight and sound from the adults around you who are also incarcerated. So there's a whole section, a whole wing of a men's prison in Michigan that's just for boys, because we've got all these children who are going to graduate into the adult system. The girls we put in solitary confinement because there's no other way to keep them. apart by sight and sound from the adults. So add to this a lot of the things that are made much more public in the media if they're talked about at all, the things like not having enough access to sanitary products. Michigan, in its infinite wisdom, passed a rule in the prisons a while back that everybody in prison only got one roll of toilet paper a month as a cost-saving measure. And I think there was a lawsuit finally filed about that to undo it. But that has terrible consequences for everybody, but it hits the women harder than it hits the men. Prisons are also traditionally designed in shapes that are meant to keep men from fighting each other and having riots. So when you separate people and you have lots of places where people can be hidden, that's actually even more dangerous for women because there are more places where you can be assaulted without being seen, or where it's really dangerous to be left alone with a male staff member, which is a terrible problem in women's prisons. So the ways that we think about prison tend to be characterized as being for men and for adults. And so when you start throwing women and children into these same systems, other kinds of complicated problems emerge. And a lot of things to do with healthcare as well that I won't completely go into right now. But that's just a small list of some of the things that affect women differently.
Is that an anomaly, like the way Michigan?
Not really.
It's the norm.
There are some states that have more than one prison for women. Depends on how big your state is and how many prisons you have, and also the sort of evolution of how prisons got set up in your state. But it's not uncommon. And it's because women are disproportionately, historically, women were locked up at much, much smaller rates than men. Now they're about 7% of the nationwide population, but we didn't expect that to happen. And we didn't imprison people in a way that said we're now going to give 7% of the space to women. So the population of women in prison has risen over 400% since 1980. And yet the facilities to hold those women, by and large, didn't really expand. And don't even get me started on what happens to pregnant women. The New York Times today was acting like it was this huge breakthrough that we're considering legislation that Trump might approve that we would stop shackling pregnant women. And there are women who for hundreds of years have given birth in our prisons in shackles. Imagine giving birth in shackles and the things that does to the baby's body and to the woman's body and causes these generations of problems. So yes, it's not that uncommon. I'm sorry that I keep going off on a tangent every time you ask me.
It's fine. It's fine. And my other panelists, the question was, why is an intersectional approach so vital? I mean, what are the most pressing issues or concerns as it relates to your organization, area?
I'll make an attempt at trying to address a couple points. So when I started doing this work, it's been about 20 years since I've really been doing it intensively. Probably the first 5 to almost 10 years I was doing it, you pretty much couldn't say or think abolition in a room, even as friendly as this one, without pretty much being, ignored, laughed out the room, or immediately kind of challenged, or whatever. So, on the one hand, you can say it in a room like this, and be heard, and even be generously invited into a discussion, right? So that's cool, right? On the other hand, as is often the case in with the circulation of any kind of radical discourse, I've actually experienced that there's a lot of folks who want to be identified as abolitionists, whose politics are entirely not abolitionist, right? Their politics are actually militantly reformist. They are not about trying to generate a creative praxis or a pedagogy that will disarticulate the premises for criminal justice and incarceration. They are not about that. They're about militant reform, and that's fine. But what's vexing and I think deeply politically dangerous is when that position names itself as an abolitionist position, right? Now imagine all the other moments in which particularly racial chattel slavery's abolition, right? Imagine in those moments the spectrum among abolitionists, right? During that moment, the latter 19th century, but more than that, but the latter 19th century in particular, mid to latter 19th century, there was already a debate among among people who name themselves abolitionists, but they to some extent, they wanted to abolish something. Whether it was the slave trade, whether it was plantation slavery, et cetera, right? Whether they wanted to colonize Africans, whether they wanted them as free citizens, there was a spectrum. But there was a kind of general politics that something needed to be abolished, gotten rid of. I'm not sure we actually have that, because what I see, and this is what I've been writing and thinking and obsessing about recently, what I hear happening a lot now are people who want to abolish mass incarceration, right? They don't want to abolish incarceration, they want to abolish criminalization of domestic war, they want to abolish Hillary Clinton wants to abolish mass incarceration as part of her platform. There's right-wing economists that argue for the abolition of mass incarceration, right? For a bunch of right-wing asshole reasons I'm not going to repeat, right? So it's to say that part of what I'm concerned with as as somebody who identifies as somebody who struggles to be a radical intellectual, right? In all the settings in which I can circulate as a thinker, as a teacher, as a talker. I think we have to always be engaging right now in the present tense a genealogy of how incarceration has become a particular object of study over the last 20 years, and therefore how it is that the discourse of abolition has become, I think deeply entangled in kind of a generalized circuit of progressive militant reform, right? I think at that point, then the critical genealogy is what we need to kind of disentangle the identification of a politics of abolition from things which are actually not trying to do that. So that's one thing I'm really concerned about. I'll say one other thing, because I hear us talking about it, right? I teach at UC Riverside, right? And when I talk about this in and outside the classroom, I talk, when I go to, you all familiar with Southern California Library and what used to be called South Central? Go see it, look them up, scl.org. It's a great site for kind of community discourse. Anyway, so these different sites I talk about this stuff with, we always end up talking about, again, using the language of warfare, we always end up talking about casualty management. Right, that's what we're doing. Like, I mean, in the last, 64 minutes, like we're talking a lot about casualty management, which is again necessary but not sufficient. So that's another concern, and I don't have a kind of formulaic, platform answer for how to get past that, because I think it's what we do. We got to talk about casualty management. In fact, a lot of our kind of popular cultural and activist discourse is very much about casualty management in this moment for good reasons, right? But again, it gets back to that circuit, like to the extent that we're in a condition of domestic war and we're always managing casualties, it's going to be really hard to abolish and end domestic war. Yeah. So that's, I think, at the root of what I think I exist for in this period.
One of the things that I've been reading your work, talking about the importance of labeling it for what it is in the context of domestic warfare. I know some of the terminology you utilize too is social liquidation and genocide, right? I mean, which is very accurate in terms of like really pointing to like a larger historical and institutional endemic problem that's really focusing on a very specific population unrelentingly, right? And obviously that's a reality. And I kind of wanted to also open it up to my other panelists to talk a little bit more about what they think.
Sure. Thank you, Dylan. I had the privilege of seeing you speak on a panel about a year ago in, where was that? Minneapolis.
Oh, that's where I saw you last.
Yeah, abolishing border imperialism. And it was a wonderful panel. And there was a conversation about around this very question about kind of methods, praxis, how we live doing this work, how we treat each other doing this work. And I have similar concerns working around immigration detention and just seeing throughout history so many examples of efforts to abolish or to close a certain facility, to end a certain practice, and the tactics used that end up kind of shooting the movement shoots itself in the foot because it's still operating within the structures that exist, whether it's, oh, we need to write more op-eds in this problematic publication, or, you know, we need to produce more data, and we need to do this. We need to work with these politicians who are our allies, and then as soon as they're reelected, they disappear. And so, yeah, working within what we, and especially in the last year with hashtag abolish ICE, and everyone picking that up in the wake of family separations, and new people joining the movement, which is necessary and important. But yeah, I'm also concerned about this lack of imagination. And when we're constantly playing within the game, you know, we're not going to win the game. And also, so I've been thinking a lot about time and space, and how incarceration, you know, impacts one's sense of time. It is, you know, doing time, the enforced boredom of it. And then those on the outside who are working in this moment of crisis, especially under Trump, everything seems urgent. It's like a losing battle, and we are mistreating each other kind of in this work a lot of the time. And a lot of the structures that exist, nonprofit organizations, going through political channels, you know, all of these options to do this work end up replicating systems of white supremacy or inequality and trauma. And so how do we address that, the traumas of the system? And these are things that are so difficult to even articulate or recognize. And maybe it does go back to just the self, the interrelationships that we develop, and really working to create spaces where it's not just in name that we're giving people a platform and a voice and taking the leadership of people inside, but actually creating things to enable that to really happen. And what does that look like? I don't have a lot of answers, but.
So I'll throw out my, you know, just again, speaking from the framework of just doing the work on the ground, I think something that has really affected our work a lot in the last 5 years or so was because of the changes in the California laws, AB 109, AB 47, that I think have done good things. You know, they have done many good things in terms of reducing from felonies to misdemeanors for like 8 crimes. One of the probably not so good things is that people, because the U.S. Supreme Court passed a law 5, 6, 8 years ago, I don't know, that we had to reduce the size of our state prison system here in California. So what that has resulted, it has resulted in our state prison population going from about 160,000 to 100,000, but more people are getting sentenced to do time in county jails, and the county jails are not set up to handle people doing long terms. So we have people now, and I know in our LA County jails doing 20, 25 years, and it's just kind of a new kind of victimization. I mean, a lot of the people we talk to will say, I'd rather get to state prison. They're ready to get out of county jail because it's so chaotic and so crowded. They would rather, if that's their choice, they would rather go into state prison. But what worries me a lot then is the lack of planning for what happens when people come back, and of course housing problems. And LA County and LA City passed a fair chance ordinance, which is a positive step. It's kind of a ban the box, maybe on steroids, if you will, but basically most employers cannot ask about a criminal record without offering as a condition of employment. Once they've offered them employment, then they could do a background check. I'm sure companies will figure out a way to still get around it, but I worry that kind of like back at Willie Horton back in Massachusetts, or wasn't it Massachusetts, Dukakis?
Yeah.
That somebody will come out and do something really awful, and then it will fuel, oh gosh, we got to go back to incarcerating everybody. So I guess that's something that I just worry about, and I think there's a lack of planning, and if you don't have housing for people and jobs for people, then it seems like it's more likely that something bad is going to happen as they try to take care of their needs. So.
Thank you. I think a couple things that I've really been thinking about, especially being trained as a humanities scholar, and diving more into the literature, lack of literature around immigration detention, and my focus is on Latinx literature, and I've been thinking a lot about like absences versus silence, right? And like, obviously absence implies it's not there, right? And silence is an inhibition or being unable to speak, right? And the importance of really speaking to these gaps, speaking to this lack, speaking to the fact that there is a presence there, but there is just an inhibition or an inability for folks to articulate that. And that's important, right? Because especially we're in academia, right? Where our role as a university is to produce knowledge, right? And going back to Tina, what you said, like the importance of who gets to tell these stories, why do they get to be told? What's being told within these, like what's being said in these gaps, or like kind of this huge, like not absence, of these silences, in the context of well, the humanities. But also in terms of community organizations too, right? I mean, obviously, there are different organizations that work with behavioral issues, that work within employment, right? But again, they're all very separated, right? And still speaks to these gaps. So why is it important to address these gaps and really spotlight them and really speak to these silences?
I think part of what's challenging about doing this work is that so often I hear people set up this us and them rhetoric, that we need to do this for people in prison, or people in, why are we talking about people in prison when we could be talking about victims, as if those were distinct categories of people, because most people who are in prison were crime victims and then have been repeatedly victimized during their incarceration as well. But the notion that everything we do has to be somehow specialized to address the kind of person who goes to prison is really problematic, because people who are in prison, people who are coming home from prison, are facing a lot of the same challenges that people out here are facing. And so instead of talking about having issues with providing adequate and affordable housing for everybody, or conversations about making access to education. Again, in the state of Michigan where I live, we have absolutely devastated the public education system because people like Betsy DeVos decided to come in and contract out the intellectual currency of our children to these folks who didn't care anything about those children. And you're raising a whole generation of people who don't think they have a future. One of my favorite students is a young man who was on probation from the criminal justice system when he arrived on our campus. And he was always saying these things to me about how everybody who was over the age of 25 was really old. And I was like, that's crazy. Quit, you're just a kid, quit saying these crazy things. But he was really insistent about always bringing it up about how once you turn 25, you were old. And the thrust behind it was that he thought he would be dead by the time he was 25. And that everybody he knew who wasn't dead, who was a black man where he comes from, was either in prison or trapped in a dead-end job for the rest of his life. And that as an African-American man from Detroit, he needed to make something of himself by the time he was 25. And this had something to do with his interactions with the criminal justice system that shaped that worldview, but it wasn't the only thing that was telling him that his opportunities were that cut off from the beginning. So some of what we call a criminal justice problem is actually a much larger systemic set of problems, where the criminal justice system has become the cages that we put people in because we've decided not to make resources available to everybody. And it is this warfare that Dylan has been describing, but it's not enough just to take away the cages. That is one massive thing that we absolutely must do. But we've also got to give people the ability to have access to the resources to live a quality of life that makes the other problems start to fall away.
I mean, just to kind of, in continuity with what Ashley was just saying, that's why I periodically will engage with the language and the analytics of genocide and proto-genocide to think about this. And it's something that I heard from formerly incarcerated people that I was doing abolitionist organizing with in the late 90s or early 2000s. It was actually Dorsey Nunn from East Palo Alto that I first heard it from. He's director now of, he's been director of legal services for prisoners with children for a while. But he used to talk about it at the start of every meeting. You know how in the Bay Area, you know, if you're in an activist organization, you start by debriefing and everybody kind of talks about what's on their mind and how they're doing. So we would do that, and I always found it awkward, like an icebreaker. But Dorsey would really make it he would really ice the room, because folks would talk about somewhat mundane stuff in the world of kind of legal advocacy or public policy or academia, and then Dorsey would come to him and he would say, "I'm Dorsey Nunn. I'm a survivor of the war on drugs. I'm a social prison for something, I think it was like 8-9 years." He said, "I'm here because I'm from East Palo Alto, and for me the prison industrial complex is a form of genocide." And it was like, okay, all right. And the thing was that there was no method or adequate political rhetoric to really take that seriously. It's not that people didn't, but there was no kind of available script to actually address what Dorsey was talking about, right? Yeah. So part of what I think we're also getting at then is that the carceral regime, it's not merely a distinction of the chattel colonial form of the United States more generally. It is absolutely that. That's where the language of social liquidation comes from, right? Like, people are forced to stay alive, but their kind of networks of affect, of love, of family and extended family, of friendship, etc., get radically disrupted, right? By a white supremacist, patriarchal, misogynist state, right? Radically disrupted by law. And all the kind of corollary institutional extensions of all those things. What that also does is it undermines and disrupts the capacity of people, ordinary people, to culturally reproduce.
Yeah.
Right? So people biologically reproduce, and the struggle is to reproduce as a people. That's what the original formulations of genocide used to talk about, cultural genocide, right? And then the Soviet Union and the US kind of axed it out because they knew that they'd be guilty. This is what happened right after World War II, during the latter stages of World War II. But if we think about what cultural genocide is, this regime is a kind of a post-1970s, accelerated iteration of how cultural genocide actually works for domestic populations that are under kind of states of police occupation, not necessarily foreign occupation, but it might as well be. So I think about that as well. That this is about the kind of silence that we have around method, around organizing strategy, around rhetoric and language, around terms, around kind of activist frameworks, and there's a lot of reasons for that that we can talk about.
I think too about the intersections of the culture of the state and the sort of lack of logic therein, the ways in which anybody who actually goes and hangs out in a prison for a while, whether you're incarcerated or you're just going in to see what's happening or visit people you love, realizes that the logic of the prison is always about the arbitrary exercise of power. Mm-hmm. So you show up, and my mother and I had been visiting my father for years wearing sweatshirts, and then all of a sudden we appear one day after driving 8 hours from my mother's house to the middle of nowhere to the prison where he was kept, and they say, "You can't come in here if you're wearing a sweatshirt." Mm-hmm. And nobody could tell us what we were going to do in or with our sweatshirts that was a threat to public safety, but apparently all of a sudden after all of these years that's a thing that you can't do, so then you have to lose time of your visit to go out and get a different piece of clothing. And often these rules are centered around how people present themselves in terms of their manner of expression, whether that's raced or cultured or gendered or whatever. And this same student who I was just telling the story about, who thought he would be dead by the time he was 25, while he was on probation, still is on probation, got a notice from the court at his mother's house saying there was a warrant out for his arrest. And he had lost his wallet about a month prior. Somebody had found his wallet and tried to use his ID and his credit card to buy a pack of cigarettes. And the credit card had already been canceled, so when the clerk runs the card, he declines the transaction, and the guy who was trying to make the false transaction reaches over, grabs the pack of cigarettes he was trying to buy, and runs out of the store, leaving the ID and credit card of my student behind to point towards somebody else as having committed this crime. So there's now a warrant out for my student's arrest, and he goes, naive as he is, despite all his interactions with the criminal justice system, he shows up at the court. And he says, "I got this in the mail and it's a terrible mistake, I lost my wallet. Like, this is not me, I just came to clear this up." And the woman behind the counter, instead of listening to him at all or seeing that he's a young 20-something with no family and no lawyer present, says to him, "Are you wearing pants?" And he was like, "I'm wearing shorts." And she says, "You can't go into court without pants. Come back." And so he leaves. He goes out to his car and he calls me and tells me what he's doing. And I said, drive out of that place right now. Do not enter that courthouse without a lawyer, without anybody there. But if he had walked, and we did get him a lawyer, it got cleared up after much tribulation. But he would have ended up in county jail that night if he'd been wearing pants. And that's just one more example of how ridiculously illogical the culture of the system is. And we don't talk about that as culture, right? That it is a cultural thing to know how to get yourself out of trouble and have resources to call people and access to the things you need in order to not have a crisis happen. It is a cultural logic to know that you should always have a lawyer present when you walk into any court of law where you might be accused of something. But it is not a cultural practice that you can't teach the culture of this arbitrary oppression to anybody because it changes all the time. But you also deliberately cannot ever make sense of it because it continues to reproduce itself in this way that eliminates all of the structures of resistance that you might have built up to protect yourself in the first place. It keeps stripping you of the people and the resources that you would need to teach you how to do something different.
No, go ahead.
As a community-based organization, I think part of what right now everybody's supposed to be partnering. For funding, you're supposed to have all these partnerships. And what I've experienced with partnering is that people just learn what you do and then they want to be the big kahunas and then they sort of take away. And I love partnering. I love working together. We certainly don't have all the answers, and I have great respect for different methodologies because people respond to different ways of trying to assist them. So, and funding kind of drives what we do. I mean, we rely on a lot of government grants, and so it just kind of keeps us in line because we have to perform. And we're grateful for the funding, but it certainly helps to define what we're going to do. And the other thing I think is just the fear of, I remember one time I was at a meeting, and there's this thing called the Inmate Welfare Fund. People know what that is? At least in LA, and I think in the state of California, it's the repository of money that's spent on collect phone calls and commissary. And it's ironic because the money mostly goes there by families who put money on the books for the inmates, but at least in LA, they've progressively chipped away at it, so now most of the money goes to the sheriff's department rather than for services for the inmates and to help the inmates. But I remember being at a meeting, and I knew there was somebody there from the sheriff's department, but I asked something about how is this money being used, and is there some way to get it out more to services? And I was called down literally that afternoon by a woman who shall remain nameless, but I was ordered down to her office. I was taken into a small room with a lieutenant, and I was told if I ever brought that up again, we would never be in that jail again. And, so when there's those, talk about the power differential, and, all they have to do is pull our rights to be in there, and there goes half of our programming. So, that makes it hard also, going back to speaking up about things. That's difficult to do too when you're trying to decide, well, is it better to get kicked out but to stand up for what you believe in, or do you just kind of suck it up and think that what we want to do is the services to inmates, and we're going to have to let some of the rest of that go. So. Mm-hmm.
Just to shift gears a little bit and go back to your question, Gabriella, about gaps and silences. As a historian, there's a large discussion of this often in the work of doing history. How do you address gaps in archival records? Why are some things documented and others are not? And how do you work against that? And I think the work, what you said earlier, Mary, about just treating people like humans, I think that the work of doing history, I'm always making a plug for history as central and important discipline, but the work of doing history, does exactly that if you are doing it mindfully to address those gaps. If you are trying to equalize historically the stories that exist, if you're trying to collect and document, doing oral histories, for example, in communities, and trying to fill in the gaps where the official record, has left behind. Because if you just go in methodologically and you do research at the Reagan Library and the National Archives, which I have done, and you get this top-down view, that doesn't, you're kind of replicating the narratives from the powers that be. One example from history that's inspiring to me is in the wake of Japanese internment, there was a lot of silence among the Japanese American community. And and Dylan, you probably know more about this, the history of ethnic studies, than I do, but it originated in, community organization and speaking out over time about experiences of internment. Before that, politicians were rushing in to fill those gaps, saying, look, the communities aren't saying anything. Internment was unfortunate. It was a mistake, but we've learned from it. It was a bureaucratic necessity during wartime. There were all these reasons why internment happened, and communities were not directly countering that in the moment, but over time acknowledging and coming together and saying, actually, it was trauma and fear of it happening again, or the trauma of the experience that explains those silences. Now we're going to speak out and organize. And that led to, during the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, led to the formation of ethnic studies. It led to the defeat of some detention policies that was very powerful, and ethnic studies within prisons, which has, as you mentioned, Dylan, was cracked down on. There's this constant pattern of resistance and retaliation, which defines the system. But I do think there's merit in paying mind to questions of memory, forgetting, and what the state and the powers that be have done to actively try to get people to forget certain histories and stories. And what a historian, humanities work, and community-based work can do is to do the work of listening and documenting.
So thank you. So at this time, I want to kind of open it up to the larger audience for any questions that you may have. I have a powerful mic here.
I don't think I can.
Oh, we just remember the recording.
At the risk of maybe exposing my own naivete, what would abolition look like? I mean, something that keeps me up, and I'm sure all of us up at night, is the idea of how do we imagine a judicial system that sort of, as you're saying, like fills in these gaps or allows for the nuances of language where humanity sits and lies. It doesn't just live in hyperbole versus banality, And so we have these, if we're talking about Dylan, right? You mentioned the difference between abolition and, what was the other one?
Reform?
I think it was militant reform.
Militant reform.
Yeah.
So what is kind of, can we illustrate the differences between these two, and more specifically, what would abolition really look like?
That's for all of us, right?
Well, a couple of things it looks like. Part of the problem is that you don't just replace the institution with another institution, right? So it would be really easy to say, we just put people in hospitals, the end. That's not what abolition looks like. Abolition looks like a whole lot of different kinds of programming, filling in many of these gaps that are so, that become such crisis points, right? So a couple of years ago, I'm blanking on the name of the man who was shot, but there was an autistic man with a care worker in Florida, and the autistic man had it wasn't a seizure or something like that, but his attention was very focused on playing with his car in the middle of his toy car in the middle of a busy traffic-filled area. He insisted on sitting down in the middle of the street as they were crossing the street, and his care worker was trying to gently get this grown man who's playing with a truck in the middle of the street out of the street so that he won't get run over by a car. Somebody sees this happening, and the care worker was black and the autistic man was Latino, and they call the police, and they say that the care worker is assaulting the man in the street, and that the man appears to have a gun, which was actually the toy car. So the SWAT team gets called in, and police rush from everywhere. They block off all the streets, and they end up shooting the care worker. He lived, but it was this huge, really terrifying trauma, and we should not have been calling the police in this instance. What should have happened is that they should have received medical assistance, and a lot of things that happen with people who have mental illness or a kind of health crisis, the police get called instead, because the police are the only people that we know how to call. There was an incident at my university where a black student went to the gym over the summer without paying the $7 that you're supposed to pay to get a day pass to go to the gym when you're not enrolled as a summer school student. And when the student at the desk asked him for ID and he didn't have it, she calls the police. And so he gets arrested by 3 armed police officers for playing basketball at the gym while it's open. And he was a university student. And there are all of these instances where we have these triggers that cause the police state to intervene in everyday interactions in our lives. This happens all the time in K through 12 education. It was absolutely chronic, for instance, in post-Katrina New Orleans, that children were just being hauled off by the police for totally minor infractions that could have been handled through restorative justice means within the school. So when we feel that we are in such a state of crisis that our only resource is the police, it causes this massive expansion of the state. So we need mental health services, we need addiction services, we need youth diversion programs, we need a lot of preventative action, and we really need to improve our educational system and our healthcare systems, because those are things that would net a lot of these crises that cause the state to intervene. The big question that ends up, or I don't know if it's really the big question, but the most pressing question that most people throw at me is that what do you do with Charles Manson, and what do you do with the bomber, and what do you do with the very worst people that we can imagine? And a lot of people won't like to hear me say this, but thinking about that problem is not how you get to the solution. So there are probably times when people are dangerous and need to be held away from others in the community for a certain period of time to prevent violence. That could be a thing, but it shouldn't look anything like what prison looks like. The way that we hold people in those situations, if they need to be held, should be about trying to promote public safety, about thinking about this person coming back to us as quickly, as safely, and as responsibly as possible. I have a friend who does prison work, or it's not really prison work, it's about what happens after violence, which doesn't look like prison in this case, in Samoa, not American Samoa, but the other Samoa that we didn't colonize quite as much. And in Samoa, if a crime happens, even something as serious as a murder, the community deals with it internally. So my friend who did this ethnographic research in Samoa was living with a family in which a man had killed his wife. And the community's response was to say, you will now, for the rest of your life, live with the parents of the woman that you murdered. You will live with your in-laws, and you owe them the debt of your life. And so he cared for them, and he had to face their grief very plainly, and the community had these kinds of restorative justice circles around him where they made him understand the gravity of what he had done and what he had taken from people. And then he needed to live in service to the people who had lost the most. And in this particular instance, it was actually working pretty well. The in-laws had grown to love him in a way that they never loved him when he was married to their daughter, because their relationship had changed so profoundly after her death. And I know that those things are really hard for us to imagine, particularly in a place as big and diverse and violent as the United States. But it just goes to show that the logic of prisons is, in fact, a colonial cultural logic, that it doesn't exist everywhere. Other people have different solutions. And I think we could do a lot of work and a lot of different kinds of diverse strategies to try to not just decarcerate, but really think differently about what justice means to us as a people. But it's not simple, and it's not an easy.
No, and I didn't mean to put, I'm just like, can we all think, let's just think out loud about what that could look like.
And I just feel like I always end up apologizing as part of this conversation, because most people so desperately want like a clear path forward. And it's not a clear path forward. It's a lot of strategizing, a lot of community building, a lot of thinking about people's public safety and real interests, as opposed to thinking about how much somebody owes to us when something bad happens.
Thank you for asking that, because I wasn't in on the abolitionist. You know, I was sitting here going, what does that mean? Because I really didn't know. other than getting rid of prisons, I guess, right, is the definition of that. And I was sitting here, was I telling you, I
We
said,
were just
well,
having this
yeah,
conversation
about,
before.
because I one of our staff members saw Richard Ramirez and when he was at Men's Central and, the Night Stalker. And she said he looked completely soulless. I mean, it gave her chills that who he was. And this is a woman who worked for us in the jails for a long time and a very big heart for the situation. But it kind of made me think too that there might be some people for which we don't have reasonable solutions. So I don't know if that makes me unpopular, but it kind of makes me wonder that. But this criminogenic needs, I don't know if people are familiar with that terminology, but this, Dylan, I'm sure. But anyway, it's kind of the concept that there have been these 8 risk factors that can lead to criminal behavior. And by addressing those, it's more of almost a medical, I don't know, like a methodology or whatever, but you identify these 8, that you test the inmates with these 8 factors, and then you give them services and dosages to address what that behavior, antisocial behavior, drug use, family connections. And perhaps if we were to do that in a better way, and I very much agree with you, Ashley, that there are so many ways that we could be doing things better and at least reduce the number of people in prison by getting them mental health care and substance abuse treatment. But I also wonder if we were doing those kind of services better, whether we could be addressing the underlying factors that led to their incarceration instead of just punishing them. Whatever good it does to sit in prison for a problem that you never address and then let you out is a pretty insane system, I think. So anyway, so that might be a way to also at least reduce that.
So I'll say that the question was what abolition looks like, right? So I would argue that it's actually not that speculative. I mean, it ought to be speculative in part, but it's not necessarily speculative from the start. I actually think that what abolition looks like is already available and present to us all the time if we're able to kind of honor and access and apprehend modalities of human being and community that are non-normative, by which I mean forms of human practice that are in antagonism with the global universality of white humanism. So I'm obviously here echoing and amplifying Sylvia Winter's lifelong praxis, but I think that she's onto something when she talks about that, when she talks about how the global dominance of mankind is fortified by its self-delusion that mode of human being is in fact the universal mode of human being, which means that all other forms of human practice, whether whether you're the Maasai people or whether you're Chicanx from San Diego, right? That all those forms of human being are disevolved, are disselected, are proto-human or subhuman or potentially human. So I think that abolitionist praxis is already present among those non-normative modes of human being because they have to be, right? Because in those in those human communities, it's a matter of survival, right? Because in many instances historically, people can't actually access the privileges and the infrastructures to become human beings in the dominant sense of human being, the white supremacist sense of human being, right? So they got to find ways to survive a proto-genocidal system, right? Whatever the system happens to be in that geography in that moment. So there's that, right? So we can think about the forms of love and community and creativity. I think it is experiment creativity. I think it's different forms of collective genius that people engage in all the time. It's already present. It's in the art, it's in the dance, it's in how people organize with each other outside formal organizations, outside the nonprofit industrial complex, and outside academia, outside funding, all that stuff, right? So part of it is about engaging with those forms of human practice, and also just not being scared of them, right? And this is what you see, like, I've learned a lot working with students who have organized this thing called the Underground Scholars Initiative.
Yeah.
So it started at Berkeley and it's happening at Riverside and other places now, and different versions of it. This is formerly system impact and formerly incarcerated generally younger people under the age of 30 that are now in college. And so I learned a lot from them talking with them about precisely this topic and this point. And what's really cool about that interaction is when these students are empowered to speak their particular non-normative human praxis, you can actually see abolitionist theorization, abolitionist critique, abolitionist infrastructure in their accounts, right, in their biographies. There's a great organization in Chicago too called We Charge Genocide. It existed for about 2 years, 2016, 2018, they're still online. But they were doing the same kind of thing. They were charging the U.S. government with genocide and kind of honoring the petition from the 1950s that was called We Charge Genocide. But they were charging the Chicago Police Department with engaging in basically low-intensity, state-sanctioned genocide against Black and Latinx youth. And the way in which they pitched it was not to use the terms of police brutality. They used the terms of police violence. And what the police were committing violence against was their particular forms of human being. Right, and that's the language they used. They said they're attacking our way of being. So they didn't even talk about criminal acts or any of that shit. Like there's just, because criminality is like that's part of being a human being is you break the fucking law. Like everybody does it, right? It's just a matter of whether you're criminalized, what your circumstances are, and what and to what extent you're self-harming or harming others or harming your community. So they don't even dignify that. It's about our modality of human being, which is to say it is flawed. It is not perfect. There's, people among us that, we wish that they would fix themselves. Like we try to fix them and they are stubborn and they're assholes. Like, this is part of being in a human community, right? It's just that some people have the room to be like that. Hence Brett Kavanaugh, Donald Trump, Donald Rumsfeld,
Yep.
Barack Obama, George W. Bush. Like they're allowed to be like that, right? They can be flawed human beings. They can be war criminals. They can engage in genocide, right? They can engage in gang rape and date rape and sexual assault. They're allowed to do that. So in some ways, that's kind of the sick, cynical, white supremacist, misogynist version of criminalizing non-abolition, which is what white people do for each other. They generally make sure that they don't fucking go to prison, right? Anybody who's ever been around a white fraternity in particular, that they back each other up, protect each other, and there's a code of silence anytime a rape happens, or sexual assault happens. That's a sick, perverse, misogynist, opposite side of the coin to what we want to talk about, right? Which is how do we create a safe, secure, nonviolent, like feminist and queer-friendly and queer solidarity, liberationist, anti-racist community in which people's physiological integrity is part of the infrastructure of what we do, and we're not just trying to protect people who are assaulting that all the time, right? So it's to say that there's two ways to see this, right? There's all the ways that non-normative humanity already engages in this as a matter of survival, abolitionism as a way of survival, or proto-abolitionism even, as a way of survival. And then there's the way that the white supremacist colonial chattel world engages in decriminalizations of itself all the time, which is a kind of sick abolitionism, like a perverse colonial chattel abolitionism. Right?
Well, it wouldn't even be abolition.
Yeah, well, it's abolition that's just reserved for them. It's what I think when people use the phrase white privilege, right? Which I think is, I was about to say I think it's a stupid phrase. I shouldn't say that. It's useful at times, but I think when people say white privilege, I think about that. I think about how it is that there's a
banks on the system in place. Right?
Yeah, it banks on it, and it makes its war more acute. And more, that's why it's asymmetrical from its foundation, right? It's not about disparity; it's about asymmetry. You know what I mean? That's a term of war. Asymmetrical casualty is a term of war, right? That's the kind of precursor of genocide.
So it's almost as if, I'm sorry, but it just sounds like maybe I'll talk to you after. But I think there's something very interesting in the idea of unearthing the language of crime. And if now we're not talking about crime, and I hesitate to say this globally, but forget the Mansons and whatever, but we're not talking about crime, we're talking about wild survival, basically.
Yeah.
If we think of it as
and it's criminalized. That's the point, right?
Process,
for colonized people, survival, so different modalities of survival have always been criminalized.
It'd be interesting to know, which maybe we won't get to, is whether there exist systems in place on a global level that we can point to as maybe soon-to-be utopian projects in new penal systems. But
it's a great question.
Yeah.
might be a question for Dylan. I'm not very sure if it is a question at all. But I've been struck partly by your description of the way resistance is folded into the construction of the system itself, and a lot of the anecdotes that Ashley's been offering is that, because that's been going hand in hand with this suggestion that we need to disarticulate this complex. But if you put that narrative of resistance and the formation of the complex alongside all of these little codes that you need to know, it seems like one of the problems is that this complex is already disarticulated. It's not that it's hidden, but it's so ubiquitous and so generic that it's all around, that you don't know the codes, not because you're outside of it, but because you're kind of already in the midst of it. It's hyper visible in some sense. And so it seems like a lot of what you're doing is actually articulating the system, not disarticulating it. And that then, so I don't know what the question is, but it makes me think about what is the kind of grammar of intervention in what you're describing as very compellingly as a war. But it's not a war like Iraq. So you can't kind of spot it's something else.
Yeah. So I'm interested in hearing what everyone here has to say about that. So I appreciate the question. That's what I was trying to get at with this crowd by naming it as the need for a practice of critical genealogy of carcerality and incarceration as an object of study, which is to like you just performed it actually, right? Like what you're actually engaging with in your question is an interrogation, a genealogical interrogation of how it is that we're even thinking about the prison and incarceration and criminal justice as a point of engagement, and how it is that we're saying at the one hand that there's a need for a politics and a praxis of disarticulation, and yet the kind of intellectual and academic and pedagogical rubrics, and also the pragmatic rubrics that are available to us are all about fixing, a suturing, and shit, man. Like we always talk about trying to stay in prison, meaning those of us who are not incarcerated. Like we're trying to keep the programming alive. And so like think about what that means, right? We're saying, oh, please let us stay in your prison, and it's also to say that as an academic and university-based object of study, it's really not that different, right? There's a kind of investment in this thing as a relatively coherent object of study. So what your question about abolition raises is the consequences of the kind of critical genealogy that you're asking for, which is say that I think the object of study might change, right? Which is also to say that to think about carcerality is no longer simply to think about sites of incarceration, right? It is also to think about those, but it is vitally to think in at least an equally privileging way about these moments of abolitionist experimentation of what I'm calling collective genius, et cetera, as the counterposition, the kind of counter inhabitation of a carceral logic that exceeds the sites of formal incarceration. But again, this is an experiment, man. Like this is about kind of trying to disarticulate an object of study while maintaining some coherence so we can actually have a sustainable conversation about how to do it. I was going to also pitch in, because I'm with my humanities friends here, right? So on the one hand, I'll say part of the question, part of the comments that my colleagues here have raised has reminded me again that abolitionist praxis has always, from its roots, necessarily been inter, counter, anti, transdisciplinary, right? So your point about intersectionality, I think abolitionist practice has always by necessity been that. It's always had to engage multiple forms of thought, of pedagogy, of politics, and practice. So I think as much as the university likes to talk about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, look at the history of abolitionist practice and you have a model, right? And by which I'm also talking about the forms of human being that we were just conversing about, right? Like there's actually a model there, right? Where there's really no separability between a form of dance that people create in their particular site of carcerality, whether it's Palestine or South Central, and public policy responses to criminal law, right? There's actually no separability there. They're one in the same cross-trans anti-disciplinary practice. So the other thing I was going to mention too is that in addition to the kind of anti-disciplinarity of abolitionist praxis, there's also a kind of carceral discursive complex that we have to engage in. We haven't talked about much here, but to think about the kind of cultural presence of policing and incarceration all the time means that as an object of study, it's already exploded anyways, right? Like it's the kind of geographies of incarceration are abstracted and turned into this kind of cultural object all the time as well. So it's always present and accessible, which means the obligation is that much deeper too. But I appreciate that point of your question too.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just was thinking of a academic conference I was at where I told someone what I study, history of immigration detention, and their response was, carceral studies is so hot right now.
Yeah.
And how just disgusting that moment felt. This discussion of intersectionality is really important. I confront these types of debates a lot in the immigration realm and questions of open borders and whether that's possible. And people say, well, what's the solution then? Just open borders? And you mentioned earlier, Gabriella, about the fear that's behind conversations around abolition, that it's this assumption that there is an alternative, that it means chaos. You know, if we open the border, then total disruption of our whole way of life, and you know, it's a very racist assumption that we'll be inundated with, you know, people, and that also, I think that couples with these conversations about what do we do with the worst of the worst, or these really bad guys. Like, that's where people's fears come from. It's important to address those fears, but I really appreciate the comments from Ashley and Dylan and the work that Mary does, and that examples abound. They are all around us in the ways in which people are surviving every day and building resilience. We were just talking before the panel as well about climate change and how that is this overarching thing that creates this existential crisis in our own lives and imaginations. And I taught a few classes here on climate change and one on climate change and migration, and the intersectionalities of those issues that students raised, and the work that we did in that class, which became another storytelling project that I created called Climate Refugee Stories, it was a way for me personally to deal with the grief of all the things that we were uncovering, and the horrors of these systems. And in that work of just kind of collecting stories and wanting them to be more solutions-oriented, realizing that there are examples all around us in every community of how people are creating alternatives, people are building resilience, people are surviving, and finding ways to move forward that bypass these systems. So that's very helpful, I think.
I don't know if I have a question. I'm not a humanities person, so I work for a nonprofit here where in Orange County. I'm basically victim witness, so I work with victims of cases where felony domestic violence and the ways that the criminal, and I actually learned this term at another panel here last week, where they don't call it the criminal justice system, they were referring to it as the criminal legal system, which I thought was interesting. But the way that the criminal legal system is really problematic for victims and people who are doing harm, you know, alike. It's just, it's unfair to everybody. It doesn't help in a lot of ways. And I was really maybe really hopeful, because they were talking a lot about just alternatives to the criminal legal system, and a lot of, you know, community work and transformational justice and restorative justice and those kind of practices that are really what is going to help everybody. I mean, we're all part of the same community. You know, so I mean, it was really a beautiful talk, and if anybody is interested, I know that there was a woman, she's a professor at Cal State Long Beach, in the School of Social Work, but she does a lot of work with restorative justice and intimate partner violence and sexual assault and things like that. And it's, you know, it doesn't happen overnight, but people have been doing it, and, you know, communities that are, you know, don't trust the legal system, for very valid reasons, have been trying to work out their own, you know, their own issues among themselves and have been doing a good job of it, you know. So it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's really about finding, you know, what is like the social capital is already existing, you know, in the communities that are already there. But there was a book too that I don't know if it would, I'm assuming that would be relevant to some people in here, called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence. It was a bit of a misnomer because she really wasn't really advocating for that, but really just de-emphasizing the criminal legal system response to intimate partner violence as the go-to response, or as the appropriate response, even most of the time, you know. And I think it spoke to a lot of the things that people are talking about in this room today. So.
Thank you. Time for one more question. I have a mic.
If nobody else, I'll ask some. So I want to come back to the question of abolition. Maybe a good place to end as a beginning. And just complicate things a bit. So the Netherlands is a society of 16 million people, which makes it equal to a medium-large state in the US. It's by far not a non-racist society, or even an anti-racist society by a long stretch of the imagination, even though its largest cities are now 40% people of color, 50% under 18 people of color. So as much as it might like to think of itself as a white society, it's increasingly not. They are down to 2 prisons in the country, looking to go to 1, right? Which is quite astonishing. I mean, if you even look at the work of Angela Davis, you know, she holds it up as a kind of model of what incarceration could possibly look like, because it looks nothing like the caging of the US. So there's a way in which even a racist society can begin to address a set of questions, right, in ways that are not as pernicious as they are here. I mean, it's predicated on a very different relation of the police to populations, to communities. It's not nearly as antagonistic. It's not nearly as ready to pull a gun, right? Not nearly as ready to shoot. I mean, the interesting case of the Florida caseworker, right? After he shot, he said to the policeman, "Why did you shoot me?" And the policeman said, "I don't know," right? So it speaks to the way in which the police are trained almost intuitively to respond by pulling a gun and shooting before, and maybe ask questions afterwards, right? So, which is to say that abolition is also about addressing the relational, I mean, as people have been speaking to by using intersectionality or articulation, the way in which these conditions of sociality are deeply interconnected. So to speak of abolition is to speak of undoing, you know, the tightness of this relation of things to each other. Right? In that sense, abolition becomes a kind of aspirational condition, not just of reaching for a set of counter institutions, but actually of opening up the conversation about the possibility of thinking differently in the way in which you've begun to express, about the range of social conditions confronting us, whether it's about borders and ICE, whether it's about policing and how policing is conducted, whether it's forms of incarceration, how you treat people who are really quite mad, if one can put it in that, right? And you know, if anybody should be in a prison, they certainly should not be, and so on and so forth. I mean, they're just a way of opening up a sort of, you know, so abolition is really the question of thinking differently about the social conditions confronting us in a way that forces people to answer for the positions that they're taking.
That 1 prison isn't like 8 million people, is it?
No, not
Just had to make sure.
I mean, it's, you know,
1/16 of
looks
the population.
by By contrast to the kaiju
Yeah.
of American prisons, it looks like a hotel. I mean, I'm serious.
And just to put a point of emphasis on what Dave was just saying, I think at its most aspirational, abolition is actually it's actually a social formation, which is to say it's not just about getting rid of shit. Ruthie Gilmore says this all the time. It's not just about getting rid of shit. It's actually about a creative and sustained practice. It's no different than saying, a feminist, queer liberatory, black liberationist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, or decolonial practice. That doesn't just mean the absence of, misogynist, racist. It actually means an ongoing practice that becomes the infrastructure of the society rather than the critique of it. And so, yeah, it's to kind of resonate also with what Stuart Hall sometimes would say, which is, well, shit, we want hegemony, don't we? Right? Like, hegemony is always a bad word, so that's because it's always shitty. But if you actually have a liberated hegemony, well, that's actually that would be cool. I don't know that I'd be ready to live in that.
Yeah.
Well, to that point, I tend to speak more in stories because I'm a theater person, but the best way that I have found to think about what does the world look like differently is, what if we actually admit that everybody in prison is part of our family? That all of these people came out of our homes and our living rooms and our communities, they are all part of us. And it could be any one of us. There, but for the grace of God, go any person in this room into a US prison, since we live in such a heavily policed, terrifying state. What if we just said, what if we have to treat everybody in prison as if that person was a beloved member of my family? Because they all are for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Your story made me think. I had a visitor one time, it was either Australia or New Zealand. I find this idea of kind of comparing country stories really fascinating. But she was talking about how one time one of their jails or prisons was getting out of control, and they went over the loudspeaker and said, "We'll give you ice cream if you all settle down." And I thought, wow, now there's a thought. I can't imagine it would ever go through any guard's mind, but it was just such a wonderful way to deal with that and humanize them, and maybe they'll respond to ice cream. So I thought that was wonderful.